Jesus and the Gospels, the podcast series with Father Denis McBride. This episode was recorded in front of a live audience at Hawkstone Hall, the International Pastoral Centre. Episode 4, Luke concluded, first images of John and frame of his Gospel.
Okay, I'd like to just finish on Luke's narrative, his opening, and then hopefully say something about John's Gospel. If you look there at the structure of Luke's infancy narrative, that page there, this is the way I would understand Luke's kind of architecture, okay? You know what a diptych is. You know, it's like two paintings that are made together, and often you can actually close them. And you could see Luke's infancy narrative as a diptych. It's like a beautiful structured painting, where the left side of the painting is the story, the old story, and the right side of his painting is the new story. And you can see how these two relate beautifully together. How John the Baptist, the last of the old prophets, comes literally out of the womb of the Old Testament. And how Jesus comes out of the womb of the Virgin, which is a great way of proclaiming that the birth of Jesus in Luke's Gospel is God's idea. There is no suggestion that Mary is waiting or praying for a child. The Annunciation of the child, Jesus, comes as a total surprise. And the virginity of Mary is important for Luke, not because it says anything biological about Mary, but because it identifies him as the unique Son of the Most High. There's a famous Chinese proverb that says, when a finger points at the moon, only a fool keeps looking at the finger. The purpose of the finger is to get you to look somewhere else. And when you listen to Luke's Annunciation narrative about Mary, about the identity, how can this come about? The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will cover you with its shadow, and so he shall be called Holy, the Son of the Most High God. Luke's very clear. The purpose for him in the narrative of the virginity of Mary is to point not to Mary, it is to point to the unique identity of who he is. And this story is connected beautifully to the next one, namely the story of the visitation, where you get the mother, in a sense, of the New Testament, the new story, going down to visit the mother of the old. And the big question is, see, it's very interesting, Luke makes these two related. Again, I don't think it's for any particular biological reason. He's making them related. Why? Because he wants to relate, literally, the story of New Israel to the story of the old one. And the big question is, would these people in old Israel recognize that they are related to this new story? And when Mary goes down to the hills of Judea to visit Elizabeth, you have this extraordinary image. Elizabeth is going to do something. She's going to recognize Mary as the mother of my Lord. You have a voice from Israel recognizing that the new story that is happening is their story too. Now, Luke has to be very careful. In Luke's Gospel, nobody recognizes who Jesus is unless they are gifted with the Spirit. So what happens? Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit because she's going to make a proclamation about the identity of Jesus. And you have this wonderful image of this old woman. And she experiences a disco going on in her womb. The child in her womb starts to dance. It's a wonderful image. If you go to Ein Karim in Israel, the traditional birthplace of John the Baptist, for the millennium, an artist has created a wonderful meeting of the two mothers. There's the old Elizabeth and the young Mary. And what he's done is they don't embrace each other. They both stand there and their wombs meet. It's a wonderful image, literally, of two worlds meeting. And the big question for each of these worlds is, will they see themselves related to one another? Because that's the anxiety of Luke's infancy narrative, to say that although this is a new story, this story, in a sense, is profoundly related to the longings of the old one. And when it comes, of course, to the birth of Jesus himself, Luke notes in a rather funny phrase that Jesus is born in the city of David. So, now what's the city of David? Anywhere else, the city of David is Jerusalem, because David captured the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. He was a clever politician, and he decided that he would make the capital of the 12 tribes in a territory that was outside the 12 tribes. Very clever. So that no tribe could say, we've got the capital in our territory. And Jerusalem has always been known as the city of David. But for Luke's purposes, because he's interested primarily in David, and Jesus is the son of David, he has Bethlehem as the city of David, because that's where David was born. That's where he was brought up. And what was he when he was a young man? He was a shepherd. Who are the first visitors in Luke's gospel? They're shepherds, not magi from the east. They're the local shepherds, because David himself started his career as a shepherd. And he quotes one of the great signs given to the shepherds is that they will see a child in swaddling clothes. And swaddling clothes is only mentioned once in the Old Testament. It's mentioned by Solomon, who was what? He was the original son of David. And Solomon says in a rather haughty, aristocratic speech in the Book of Wisdom, he says, when I was born, I breathed in the common air. Because he's the son of a king. But when he talks about his birth, he says, when I was born in swaddling clothes. No other king has had any other entrance into life. And often popularly, when that image is preached, the swaddling clothes is offered as a sign of Jesus' poverty. It's not a sign of his poverty for Luke. Jesus is the son of David. And like the original son of David, he will be born in swaddling clothes, because no king has had any other way into life as out of it. Because what happens at the end of the life? You are wrapped again in swaddling clothes. Okay? So for Luke, that image of the son of David is a very clear one. And then finally, you meet, at the end of the infancy narrative, you meet two old people again. Luke's the only evangelist who opens his gospel with old people. He's very clever because old people are supposed to be long on memory and short on expectation. See, the longer you live, the thing about the past is there's more of it. And the longer you live, the future gets shorter and the past gets longer. And the temptation is, when you become seriously old, that you look back at the times you had, where you have been, the people that you lived with and loved. And the fascinating thing about these four old people, the two old couples, is that they're not looking back. They're looking forward. Something yet to happen dominates their life. They're not paging through old photograph albums. They're not antiques. They're alive in their life to something that has yet to happen. And you watch the family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, uphold the law by going down to the temple. And when they're in the temple, you watch two old people who have been waiting, these wonderful waiting figures, who are stubbornly refusing to die until what they wait for is fulfilled. And you watch an old prophet, Simeon, okay? You watch this old man take into his arms the youth of God. It's a wonderful image. The old prophet in the temple at the heart of Israel takes this child into his arms and recognizes the child as the longing answered of Israel. It's beautifully done. And of course he hymns that beautiful prayer, the Nunc Dimittis, now Lord, you can let your servant depart in peace. Why? Because my eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared, who for all the nations to see, a light to enlighten the pagans and the glory of your people Israel. It's fascinating, this. Simeon announces the theology of Luke. Can you hear how that goes beyond Matthew? Matthew's Jesus is the glory of Israel. Luke's Jesus is what? He's not just the glory of Israel, is he? He is a light to enlighten the Gentiles. So Luke extends his frame, do you see, way beyond the frame of our friend Matthew. And Luke is going to have a much larger frame than our friend Matthew. And that's why later, at the end of chapter 3, when Luke gives the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, who does he go back to in his genealogy? He goes back, right back, doesn't he? He goes back to Adam. And he calls Adam son of God. Wonderfully and beautifully done. When you're preaching Luke's gospel or listening to it, you're not simply in a Jewish story. You're inside a human story. Because for Luke, as Simeon announces in the beginning of the infancy narrative, this child is given not just as the glory of the people Israel, but a light to enlighten the Gentiles. And you have the image too, don't you, of old Anna, another old person in this story. Wonderful old lady. Her days of girlhood are over. Well, she's 84, that's true. And she never leaves the temple. She's one of these old ladies who's forever hanging around the sanctuary. And the reason she's hanging around the sanctuary is she's waiting for something to happen. She's a wonderful image of somebody like as if she's God's neighborhood watch. She's there permanently. Nothing is going to get past this woman because she's there and she's alert and she's alive to what is actually happening. She's got a theological nose. And Luke says nicely, she just happened to be passing. Like hell. She'd pitched her tent there. Again, an image of an old person who's utterly alive to the present moment. Something is going to happen, and by God, she ain't going to miss it. She's going to be there. Again, you got the image of the two old people who see in Jesus this wonderful fulfillment. Luke does something at the beginning of the public ministry that Matthew doesn't do. If you turn over to chapter 3 and look at verse 5 and 6 of Luke's Gospel, when John the Baptist starts his ministry, just as a preface to the public ministry of Jesus, he quotes Isaiah. But he quotes the end of Isaiah chapter 45. Matthew quoted, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord, make his path straight," keeping it within the Jewish story. What does Luke do? He extends the quotation, and what's the last line of it? "And all mankind shall see the salvation of God." Matthew doesn't include that bit. Why? Because he's concerned to speak a Jewish story. Luke includes it because he's speaking a story that will touch everyone. Luke believes that Jesus is given as a gift, not just to the Jewish people. He profoundly believes that Jesus is a gift to all of humanity. And that's why he takes the genealogy of Jesus right back to Adam, right back to the Son of God. It's as if one of the ways you can image it, dear friends, is in circles. You've got a small circle of Matthew, a small frame. And this frame is the prophetic story of Jesus. And this is told by Mark. Our friend Matthew has a bigger frame for his story, okay? Because he's putting the story of Jesus into the Jewish frame, okay? And then watch Luke. Luke has a much bigger frame again. He's going to put the story of Jesus and connect it with the human story. His frame is much, much bigger. So that when you're preaching or listening to the Gospel of Mark or Matthew or Luke, you're inside dramatically different frames. Okay? Dramatically different frames. Of the three of them, of course, Luke is by far the most generous. His Jesus has arms that are wide enough to embrace the world. And that's fascinating. You notice, by the way, a simple thing. As the Gospels are written, the frames get bigger and bigger. until you come to the last gospel, the Gospel of John. If you go back to John, dear friends, and you say, John gives you the frame of his gospel right at the very beginning, in the first couple of sentences. John does even more than Luke, doesn't he? John's story of Jesus begins outside the human story and outside the cosmos. He begins the Jesus story outside human experience, outside time, outside history, where he says, in the beginning, this is going to be not a human story. When you move into John's Gospel, dear friends, you realize from the word go, you're inside a divine story. Okay? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Literally, it says he was turned to God, literally from the very beginning. In other words, the Word is in relationship with God right from the beginning. Now beat that for a beginning. Totally outside. One of the ways you can look at the gospel, or the prologue rather, of John. The prologue, dear friends, is made up of a comparison basically between two. Between the Word and the witness. Between the Logos and the Anthropos, the man who is sent by God. If you look at the beginning of the prologue of John, the beginning announces, doesn't it, the identity of who this is. That the Word was with God and the Word was God, and that he was turned towards God literally since the beginning of time. Okay? Then you've got a proclamation of the function of the Word. What did this Word do? John says, through him all things came to be. He is the creator of all. And then he repeats it in case you're slow. Not one thing came to be, but through him. And then he repeats it if you're seriously thick. John is very anxious that you get him, and he keeps repeating things. And then he says, all that came to be had life in him. He is the ancestor of the whole of the human race. Why would John not have a genealogy of Jesus in his gospel? Because Jesus is the ancestor. He is the beginning of every story. That's why John has no genealogy. Because for him, the beginning of Jesus is with God, in the Godhead itself. He's the ancestor. Through him all things came to be. Not one thing had its being, but through him. All that came to be had life in him, and that life is the light of all peoples. So he agrees with Luke on this one. The light of all nations or all peoples. Depends how you translate it. Okay? You're a long way away from Matthew's story and Mark's story. This is not a Jewish story. In fact, John will appear to be anti-Jewish in his gospel. This is the one who is given as the light of all nations, a light. And then he notes this sign, a light that shines in the dark, a light that darkness cannot overpower. One of John's great themes, the fight that's going to happen between the light and the darkness. Okay. So it gives you the identity of the word and the function of this word in relation to the universe. What does he do then? He goes over here. He gives John the Baptist extraordinary importance by putting John the Baptist right into the prologue of the gospel, just as Luke puts John the Baptist into the infancy narrative. They all agree, if you're going to tell the story of Jesus, you have to tell the story of someone else, namely John the Baptist, because these two stories are so interlinked. And I was doing this on the computer last night, and I put it in a page. You don't have to take this down. I've put it on a page of notes. I'll put it in the coffee room. I forgot to bring the page up. The identity, who is this? He's a man, an anthropos. And he's a man who has been sent by God, okay? And his name simply is John. He never calls him John the Baptist. He's not interested in portraying John the Baptist as someone with a kind of independent career. This guy is John, and his purpose, the word he puts beside him all the time is this one. He's not John the Baptist in this gospel, he is John the witness. And what's his function in the gospel? Very much this one, isn't it? He came to bear witness. That's the purpose of John the Baptist in the fourth gospel. He's the one who's going to bear testimony, literally. He's the witness. He's going to bear testimony, and he's going to be a witness to speak for the light, okay? That's his purpose, a witness to speak for the light. And then there's a note of nervousness, isn't there? He was not the light. Why would he put that in unless a lot of people thought he was? John the Baptist is not the light, and then he repeats it in case you're seriously thick. He says he was only a witness. He tells you 5 times John's a witness. And then he goes over here, doesn't he, again? He comes over here to the human story now. This wonderful image of the Logos is coming into the world, okay? Wonderful image. And then he tells a story of double rejection. He's told you the identity and the function of this word. And now, it's very dramatic. He's going to tell you the story of the word's coming. He was coming into the world that had its being through him, but what happens? The world does not know him. You've got a story of rejection. Then what does he do? He takes the story right into the Jewish story, doesn't he? He came into his own domain. And what happens? His own people do not recognize him. In other words, John says, this Logos is the stranger from heaven. Some of you will have seen the film E.T. extraterrestrial. This is John's Gospel. And I'm not trying to be funny when I'm saying Jesus is E.T., literally. His origins are totally extraterrestrial. They're outside the human story. And that when he comes into the human story, he experiences a double rejection from the world that he made and from his own people. So you've got the story here that when the Logos comes into the world, you've got a story of double rejection. Right at the beginning. Like Matthew, John uses his prologue like an overture. Like an overture. And the overture is going to sound notes that you're going to hear later. Does that make sense in the gospel? You've been told in the overture that his story is already a story, before you read it, that this is a story of rejection. He is the stranger from heaven, who's not going to be accepted into the world that he made or into his own people. But to all who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God. Now, that will get the Jews very angry. He gave power. How? In other words, this one is in charge of who are the children of God. The Jews will take enormous exception to this. If you are a chosen people, there's one qualification for being a Jew. You need to be born of a Jewish mother. You can be uncertain about fathers, but you're never uncertain about the mother. Because the child comes out of an identifiable womb. And Jesus will later have this famous argument with Nicodemus when he tells a Jew that he must be born again. And Nicodemus resists that powerfully. How can I go? Because his identity as a Jew is from his mother. So he says, how can I go back into my mother's womb? Because that's where he gets his identity from. And suddenly Jesus is talking about being a child of God independent of whatever womb you came out of. In other words, you're talking about a concept of the children of God that is totally independent of your race as a Jew. This is kind of fairly radical stuff in the prologue. To all who did accept him. So anyone who doesn't accept him is not a child of God. John is very powerful and quite exclusive on this theme, and he'll develop this. And then the Word, of course, was born not out of human stock or urge of the flesh or will of man, but of God himself. Now think about that. He was born of God himself. Notice the fourth evangelist does not have a birth story. He doesn't mention a mother, does he? He doesn't mention a place. He doesn't mention witnesses. He's not remotely interested in the birth of Jesus. Why? Because Jesus' beginning is not his birth. Jesus' beginning is in the Godhead. He has no interest in the birth of Jesus himself. And Mary plays no part in this prologue. John says he's born of God himself. The Word was made flesh, and he lived among us, and we saw his glory. This is extraordinary. He goes from a time outside human experience and outside time to the experience of the community in 14 verses. Now try it. This is a brilliant piece of architecture. In 14 verses, to go from the origin of the Word that is God up here into the experience of the human community that knew him and lived with him. And he uses this phrase, we saw his glory. Now, in the other Gospels, one of the central stories in each Gospel is the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus reveals what? Where Jesus reveals his glory. In John's Gospel, Jesus reveals his glory all the time. So he doesn't have a story of the Transfiguration. Remember the first wedding, Feast of Cana? Remember the first sign? And how does it end? John says the disciples saw his glory. For John, the glory of Jesus is going to be evident in his own ministry. So he drops that story of the Transfiguration. And then it goes back over to John's role in the human story. What's John going to do? John appears as his witness. And as a witness, he's able to say, unlike in the other Gospels, this is the one. In Mark's Gospel, he doesn't know Jesus. In Luke's Gospel, he doesn't know Jesus. By the time John comes to write his Gospel, John the Baptist will know Jesus. Why? Because his function is to play a witness to Jesus in the Gospel. And the purpose of being a witness, if you get up in a witness box, the purpose of your being there is that your authority as a witness is you can say from your own experience, I saw him, I heard him, I knew him. That's the authority of the witness, somebody who can testify from their own experience. Is that making sense? So you've got this wonderful, in the prologue, this wonderful movement. And the purpose of the prologue is to tell you, the reader, in the Gospel, the divine origins of the Christ. You don't have this in any of the other Gospels. Only in John's Gospel do you have an incarnation. In the Gospels of Mark or Matthew or Luke, there is no belief in a pre-existent Christ. So there's no point in talking about an incarnation in the other Gospels. It doesn't make any sense. Mark, opens his Gospel with what? An adult Jesus who leaves home. In the other two Gospels, the stories begin. Jesus comes into existence for the first time in his birth. It's only John says his origin is actually outside the human story. And when you look at one of the things that you notice when you look at John's Gospel is when he writes the Gospel about the story of Jesus, if you see, you're a reader of the story, right? And you've read the prologue, okay? And the prologue gives you the origin of Jesus. When Jesus begins his ministry, dear friends, nobody knows what you know. Is that making sense? In other words, if there was a dramatization of John's Gospel and you came late and you missed the prologue, you'd be watching a different story. Because one of the big questions in John's Gospel, in his arguments with the synagogue, where do you come from? By what authority do you do the things you do and say the things you say? By what authority? You, the reader, know. His authority is with God. But the people inside the story don't know that. Raymond Brown, my old professor, always argued that one of the ways you can understand John's Gospel is to realize that John's Gospel was written in sharp conflict with the synagogue authorities. By the time John's Gospel is written, John's own community have been thrown out of the synagogue. They've been ejected from the synagogue. And you see some of that story written in John 9. Remember when the blind man is in argument with the Pharisees and the scribes, and he comes to believe in who Jesus is, and what do? They cast him out. If you go into a synagogue and you say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, there's one thing for sure. You'll not be allowed to become a member of that synagogue. There's a clarity in that. And by the time John's Gospel is written, you watch John as a pastor, and he's a magnificent pastor. How do you find a spirituality for your people who have been thrown out of the synagogue? Who've been alienated from their own tradition. Can you imagine as a Jew, you're brought up in your own tradition, you keep the law, you celebrate the feasts. This is your identity. Then you start to believe in Jesus, that he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And the synagogue authorities say, you can't stay here if you believe that. That's not part of our belief, and they get expelled. And dear friends, once a group gets expelled, the discussion ends. Issues are intensified, aren't they? They're reinforced. So how are you going to substitute for all these feasts at the temple and all the liturgies? Watch how John does it throughout his gospel. The temple is gone. The temple will be destroyed, and Jesus says, and I will build it back up in 3 days. But he's not talking about a building. And you watch in John's gospel, Jesus himself is going to replace the temple. Remember with the Samaritan woman. And she says, where should you worship? In the temple in Jerusalem or up there on the temple on Mount Gerizim? And he says, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. The time is coming. It is here already. When you will worship neither on the mountain nor in Jerusalem, but you must worship in spirit and truth. You've got to find a spirituality that has no temple. You look at the story of John's Gospel as he goes through the feasts. The story of tabernacles. When in autumn they gather in the wine. And they pray for rain, because if you have no rain, you have no crop. And if you're in the temple, you watch the priest pouring water on the altar in the hope that it will rain. And at that feast, what does Jesus say? He says, I am the source of living water. If you are thirsty, you come to me. At the Feast of Lights, when the temple is lit up from the outside, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. At the Feast of Hanukkah, which celebrates the rededication of the temple, Jesus says to the people, I am the one the Father has consecrated. I, not the altar. And at the Feast of Passover, at the very time the lambs are being slaughtered in the temple, what happens? The Lamb of God is being slaughtered on the cross. What is John doing? He's writing a gospel for a lost people to give them a new identity in Jesus. What do you do, dear friends, when you've been thrown out from the tradition that gave you life? So that in John's gospel, when John speaks about the Jews, who is he speaking about? He's speaking about those who do not accept Jesus. So Jesus gets up in front of the Jews and he says to them, I told you, Jews. Now, an American does not get up in front of Americans and says, I tell you Americans. As if, and somebody says, well, who are you? Dear friends, this is alienated language. It's alienated language. John is trying to find a spirituality that is now independent of the Jewish tradition. And that spirituality is centered on Jesus. He's writing for a people who must find their spirituality in the person of Jesus, not in their tradition. And that's why there are times when the Gospel of John almost sounds anti-Semitic, where Jesus says to them that they're sons of the devil. Now, John is not talking about Jews of all time. He's talking about the Jews of his own time who have rejected Jesus. That's his definition of a Jew. And he's finding a spirituality, and of course, what better spirituality can you have than to say that the one who comes from God, everyone who believes in him will become what? Will become the children of God. So your identity now is not as a Jew. Your identity is as a person who believes in Jesus, and because he or she believes in Jesus, they become a child of God. So when somebody says, who are you? What's your identity? Because I heard you lost it. And you can say, no, my pastor John has told me that I am a child of God. And that there's one I must follow, who is the way and the truth and the life. And that my identity is going to be in following him, because he has his origin in the Godhead himself. That's why, dear friends, in many ways, if you're preaching, probably the most difficult gospel to preach is John. Because always you have this irony that you, the preacher and the reader and the listeners, know his divine origin. Yet the people inside the gospel don't seem to know anything. They say, are you a Samaritan? Where do you come from? And you, the reader, said, if you only read the prologue. So, I find it fascinating to get a sense of the frames. The prophetic story of Mark, the Jewish story of Matthew, the great human story of Luke, and of course the great divine story of John's Gospel.
While listening to these recordings, you might want to have the book Jesus and the Gospels beside you. You can order your copy at www.rpbooks.co.uk or find the ebook for your smart device. Thank you for joining Redemptorist Publications on this journey with Jesus and the Gospels.